Kyle McNulty, and you're listening to Secure Ventures, the show that follows cutting-edge founders in the cybersecurity space to understand their plights, glories, and revolutionary products. With me in this episode is Chris Wysopal. Chris is co-founder and CTO of Veracode, an application security powerhouse which was last valued at $2.5 billion in March 2022. The company was founded in 2005 as a code review automation platform and has since evolved to be one of the gold standard application security tools. Before founding Veracode, Chris worked as a security researcher and engineer for a decade, where he grew frustrated with the manual source code review process. In the episode, we discuss how long it took Chris to believe he'd really created something special, the important technical decisions the team made, both early on and later in the company's life, and how the DevSecOps movement and new entrants impacted Veracode's market positioning. This episode is brought to you by VulnCheck. VulnCheck helps teams defend against weaponized exploits by delivering the most comprehensive vulnerability and exploit intelligence in the market today. VulnCheck gives enterprise and federal teams better, faster data so they can autonomously prevent exploits and reduce risk and outpace adversaries. So what's different about VulnCheck? The company delivers its solutions to teams in machine-readable and consumable formats for a truly autonomous approach to vulnerability prioritization and exploit mitigation. VulnCheck has close to 300 million unique data points, which is 5 times the exploits of ExploitDB, and 200 plus CVEs packaged into complete detection artifacts for proactive teams. VulnCheck provides a full suite of solutions to enable teams with rapid adoption of VulnCheck data, including its community tier of offerings and its enterprise class solutions, exploit and vulnerability intelligence, and initial access intelligence. With VulnCheck, teams can proactively defend against remote execution events, enrich every data source, and continuously outpace adversaries. If you're interested in learning more about VulnCheck and checking out the free community edition where you can play with their database of known exploited vulnerabilities, please click the link in the show description so they know you came from the podcast. Chris, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, it's great to be here with you, Kyle.
So we're going to go back a long time, back to 2005, 2006, when you were getting started with Veracode. But to briefly touch on what kind of led you into that moment. You've been working as a security engineer, security researcher for, I think, about a decade at that point across a variety of different companies. If I'm remembering right, your most recent kind of experience at that point was at Symantec. You were a director on the threat research team over there for about a year. Can you tell me how that experience kind of led into your understanding of some of the different challenges in the AppSec space and into the origins of Veracode?
Yeah, so the reason I was at Symantec was because Symantec had acquired AppSec, which was a security consulting company that I was one of the first employees at, started in end of 99. And it was acquired in 2004 by Symantec. And I was VP of R&D at AppSec, and basically in charge of, vulnerability research and building tools for consultants to use. And that continued on as I was part of Symantec, but the resources of Symantec are obviously much greater and able to talk to a lot of people across like the teams you're talking about, threat research and threat intelligence. But what really informed Veracode was trying to build these tools for consultants. So consultants would go out and do application risk assessments. They would do manual pen testing. They would do manual code reviews, like they would talk to developers and do threat modeling. It was a very manual process, and that's all we could do at the time because no one had built automation yet. And what was running through my mind was, we could do this for the largest banks, the largest software companies, but it's just not going to scale, right? It's just not going to scale to all the software that was being built. So that's when me and my co-founder, Christian Ryu, who was also at AppSec and then Symantec at the time, said, we really need to go out and start a company that is just focused on automating all this manual effort. And the first thing we tackled was code review because that was like the worst, right? You're just reading. I mean, some people would only get through a few thousand lines of code a day, and applications have hundreds of thousands of lines of code. It would take like half a year, right, or a year to do applications, and that's totally impractical. So that led us to try to push Symantec to do it. And at the time, Symantec wasn't interested in really application security. It was a completely new field. There's only tiny companies doing it. Big companies don't do something until tiny companies do it and start to get revenue that reaches the numbers that they start to care about.
So that's exactly what I was going to ask about, is whether you considered kind of opening up this new product line under the kind of same consulting umbrella. And it sounds like from a timing standpoint, it only kind of came to mind as a key opportunity once you were under that Symantec umbrella. Was it something you'd looked at all under At Stake, but maybe you didn't have the resources?
Yeah, we really just didn't have the resources. It's really hard to create a software company inside a consulting company. It almost always fails, and that's why you see spin outs. You see sometimes a few people from a consulting company spinning out and forming a software company, but the economics are just so different. But even when we got to Symantec is just like, we don't build tools for developers. We're focused on, they were focused on endpoint, right, and mail and things like that. So what was sort of a missed opportunity for Symantec to lead the market became a great opportunity for me and my co-founder to start a company. So I can't complain that I lost the argument at Symantec.
So you decided to go out and start a new company, spin out from Symantec. What was the minimum viable product idea in your mind? You said, okay, there's this massive code review process that's taking place. It's all manual today. We want to go ahead and automate it to some extent. You have all these different languages, all these different kind of angles within the code review that you could take in terms of what you look for. What was the approach?
Yeah, so one of the big things that we did, which was really different, was we kept the mindset of the when we were consultants, which was, this is something that companies don't have the expertise to run themselves. And so we decided that instead of making a tool, that we would make a SaaS application. And this was really early on in the SaaS days. This was before NIST had even coined the term SaaS. We called them on-demand applications back then. That's what Salesforce was back in 2006. It was software on demand. And so it was really early days, and we were kind of figuring out how to do this. But what we thought was, this needed to be a service. And we needed to be able to combine some consulting services with the tools. And I hate to call it tools because that we don't want to call them tools, right? Because it's software as a service. And so I think that was one of the big differentiators that we had with some of the nascent other application security tools that were starting at the time, was we could be used by companies that had no AppSec expertise, right? So the big banks, they had people that did pen testing internally and things like that. But the average company building software had no expertise. And so building this as a SaaS service really helped them build it into their security team. And we found that CISOs really, really liked that.
Looking back, do you think there was a noticeable trade-off in terms of product growth and product development while also trying to deliver this model that had a bit more of a kind of services touch on it? I would assume those customers then ended up being slightly higher touch and required some more, just kind of working with them on a regular basis, customization, et cetera, whereas maybe that talent could have otherwise been spent specifically on product. And you just mentioned the kind of positives of it, where now these companies that don't have full AppSec teams can use your product. There's maybe an untapped corner of the market. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so it definitely took longer to get started because we needed to build a SaaS environment. And back then there was no cloud. So you had to build your own data center. You had to build your own full stack. And so it definitely took more resources. Our competitors were raising like $4 million. We raised 20 because we needed more engineers. We needed to build more things. And we needed to build out that customer success team, the people that would help people use the tool well, right? And so the tool companies were basically saying, hire consultants from one of the big four or someone who focuses on application security. Hire consultants to run the tool in your environment, right? And we said that's a bad model. This is why SaaS is so much better than that model, because you hold that SaaS vendor accountable to provide a great experience end to end, without this consultant in the middle sort of picking up the slack for the tool and making the customer happy. So tool vendors don't have to make the customer happy if they require consultants. They have to make the consultants happy, right? They have to make the consultants money. And so the downside of that is you don't get as much traction with the consultants out there. You don't get as much traction with the big four because they can't make as much money from doing a lot of services. Now that has changed now. Like the big four obviously work with SaaS vendors now because it's really the default. But 17 years ago it was completely new. And so we had to have that end-to-end experience, which I think is a much better experience in a separate tool and a separate consulting company.
So then what about some of the different product features that you maybe have to prioritize based on that new user profile, right? Where instead of having consultants that are specialized in this tool and work in this tool day in and day out, 365 days a year at a bunch of different clients, you're kind of building it into the workflow of a more just well-rounded security team in general, let's say.
Yeah, I think the thing that it forced us to do was not just have something that did analysis. It basically, you feed code in and it gives you a set of results, right? Because what does a consultant do with the set of those results? They put their own prioritization on them. They put their own policy on them. They say, hey, you need to. I know your business risk. You need to fix the criticals and the highs for this app and this, and they layer that on. They layer on reporting. They layer on analytics where they're using like a third party, business analytics tool. And so we had to build all that because there were no consultants to do that. So early on, we allowed you to put in the business risk of the applications and set policies for, what risk needed to be remediated by what time. And we put in reporting and analytics so you could look across a portfolio where the other tools had none of this. So like, say you had 20 critical apps and you hired consultants to scan all of those and tell you what to do, right? They would give you breakdowns like quarterly, like you've remediated this app's behind, this app is ahead. We built all of that. So we ended up building a lot of that functionality, which is now sort of that functionality for the enterprise, for the CISO, which is separate and really needed from just the raw, feed me software and give me a list of results stuff, which the competition was doing at the time.
Yeah. And so just thinking about the timeline here a little bit, started the company 2005, 2006. When do you feel like it had kind of become a company that you thought, okay, this thing really has legs and we see the potential for this to work out longer term? We kind of had this idea of a SaaS model here. There are all these different technical challenges that you've just alluded to, right? In terms of addressing these kind of dual-pronged features now, not just building out the capability to assess the code, but also how are you presenting it and prioritizing it, providing some remediation information. When did it get to that point for you?
Yeah, so it took a lot longer than I thought it would.
Okay.
And this is the story of almost every startup. Like it takes a while to get that, product market fit, to get traction with customers that you can reference. I would say it took about 5 years.
Wow.
Probably around like 2011 or so. I felt like we were really kind of hitting our stride, and that's when the growth really started to take off. So that's if anyone is a founder here, it takes a long time. Our second CEO came in at about 5 years into the company's history, and the first thing he did was he put up a graph showing exits from startup companies, and the average time to an exit was 10 years. He's like, if you thought you were going to exit in 5 years, it's going to be another 5 years. And that's one of my biggest pieces of advice to founders is like, you're in here for a 5 and probably a 10-year commitment.
Thinking back on that first 5 years, then we'll talk about the kind of growth transition next. But thinking about that first 5 years, what was something that proved to be a kind of critical technology decision in hindsight? So we already talked about this model of going after the kind of SaaS versus tool decision. Was there anything else that, as you reflect on it, you say, we didn't maybe fully appreciate at the time, or maybe you did, and we're so glad that we went with that option?
Yeah, it was really making it a platform. So we originally built, we started with static analysis, and we built all this, we'll just call it, enterprise, risk management and reporting functionality around the raw results. We sort of built that, and this was a little bit of a mistake, right? We built it to serve static analysis, right? We built it to serve, application, line of code, issue. What we realized was, we had built a platform, but it was static centric. And what we really needed to do is we needed to add other ways of analyzing code or analyzing applications, because static isn't good for everything. It certainly doesn't solve the open source risk problem. It's actually bad at a lot of things that you can only find in production. Dynamic is good for that. So we realized at one point that we needed to be a multi-technology company, and that we had to open up the platform so it could deal with results from SEA tools, from manual analysis, from dynamic analysis, and so we had to really sort of update the platform so it wasn't, so everyone else could be a first class set of results for an application, open up policies so it said, hey, you need to run SEA on this at least quarterly. You need to run dynamic on this monthly. And so opening up policies in that, so it worked with lots of different AppSec technologies. And that proved to be, critical. And Veracode was really an innovator there. Everyone now is like, oh, you have to have all these different things all working together. We had this back in like 2011, 2012, when we started adding dynamic and then SEA.
What was the thought process like of opening up the platform so Veracode could actually ingest other tools findings in like the SEA space, for example, versus building it yourselves? What were some of the trade-offs you considered there?
So that was something that we actually never did. And the only way we're doing that now is with our recent acquisition of Longbow, because of this whole category of ASPM has really shown to be necessary, because it's rare that a company uses just one vendor set of tools. And then when a new technology comes out, maybe it's container scanning, infrastructure as code scanning, you don't have that yet. You don't automatically have that when some startup builds that and starts to have traction. You want to ingest those results in. So now ASPM allows you to ingest results from multiple vendors. So we've gone a long time without being able to do that, but we can do that today with our acquisition of Longbow, which is actually pretty recent, which is pretty exciting.
And at the time, your thinking was, okay, we can go ahead and build this, so we don't really need to allow some of this kind of interaction between platforms, or what was the thought process?
Yeah, our thinking at the time was we would build it or buy it, right? Sure. We ended up building SCA at first, and then we said, hey, this market's moving really quickly, and we need something better, so we bought a better SCA product, which was our SourceClear acquisition in 2017. And so we thought we would build it or buy it, but the market is just moving so fast now. I don't think anyone can build or buy everything, and there is a reliance on other analysis vendors into that platform ecosystem that still needs to have policies and reporting and fit into a workflow.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit more about how your role changed during that growth transition, right? So the first 5 years, you're kind of figuring it all out, and then you feel like, okay, we have something here. You bring in the new CEO. There's all this excitement around the potential, building out new features and turning it into a platform. How did your role or kind of overall experience, thoughts about the company change during that segment?
Yeah, I think over time, as we built out the team, I moved from more internally focused to more externally focused. I'm like, we have people that understand how to build this stuff. They understand application security. I don't need to be as much in the engineering side of the business. I can be more, externally facing, and also focus on sort of our hardcore, expertise around security analysis. So as opposed to looking at building reporting or analytics or, integrations with another, risk management tool, some of those basic enterprise things that you just have to have. I focused more on the security research team and making sure we were researching the right things. And we had really good results quality. Like, that is one of the things that I'm most proud of at Veracode, is just our deep analysis, where we have, low false negatives, low false positives. We support a huge number of languages and frameworks. And that's really one of our core differentiators that focusing on the research team has allowed us to do as a company. So I think it is interesting. My role has changed to like getting deep on sort of the security analysis part of the business, but also focusing more externally.
What was your approach to prioritizing different languages to support? Was it, okay, what are most companies using? Or was it, hey, we have a certain prospective customer here that has committed to us, if we can go ahead and support X language, now this is an immediate need, and now we're going to spin this up as soon as possible?
So we did try that latter once, and it didn't really work out well, because you have all these missed opportunities because you're focusing on one customer. So we had this one big customer that was really going all in on Ruby on Rails. Remember how hot Ruby on Rails was like 10 years ago? It was the new hot thing, and we didn't support it, and no one supported it because it just didn't have. It had only been around for a short amount of time. And this one customer said, hey, I'll give you development dollars. I'll commit to, an annual subscription with you. But the problem was, we ended up building it mostly just for that one customer, because Ruby never took off. So really what we do is we look across our entire customer base, and we look to make sure that lots of customers are utilizing a particular language or framework, and then we build the support for it. It's a daunting challenge, though, because if you think of how the matrix keeps growing, because now once you support that, every new version of the language, every new version of the framework, you have to support, and some of these are major updates every year, like Apple with iOS. They're adding a major amounts of new APIs every year, because it's just, they have more developers building capabilities that then we have to understand than certainly we do.
Yeah, it's a good point in terms of the kind of long-term commitment that comes with supporting one of these new languages. Hard to kind of just deprecate it and say, hey, no, we're no longer doing that.
No. And it's interesting because you end up being like sort of forward-looking on the new up-and-coming languages, like, Go and Rust and things like this. And the new up and coming frameworks, like all the JavaScript frameworks. But then you look backwards too, because then you have big customers that are saying like, hey, I want COBOL support. And then at some point we're like, I guess we got to build COBOL support. But a lot of big companies still run COBOL. Like the IRS is one of our customers, and they have a lot of COBOL apps.
Yeah, I believe it. So thinking back to the kind of competitive landscape, you mentioned how when the company first started, you went ahead and raised $20 million. Your competitors were raising $4 million. You talked about that kind of transition period into growth stage where you were becoming this full platform. You were building all these different features. So you kind of have this leg up against the competition, let's say, in terms of the kind of integrated platform, SCA, DAST, SAST. Then kind of 2015, 2016, you have Snyk, Contrast start emerging into the space. A lot more attention for AppSec generally. Some big rounds that are being funded there. What was your perspective at the time? Was the team a little like worried, honestly, about these new players that were coming in? How'd you think about it?
No, competition is good. Like the worst thing for a company is to like sail off into obscurity. You know,
Sure.
You want a vibrant, growing market that investors want to invest a lot of money into companies. That's the kind of market you want to be in. Like, do you want to be in the AI market right now? Of course you do, right? And there's huge players investing a lot of money to do that, but and that's good. So it's good, and you know the new competitors push different things. Like Snyk has really pushed the idea of developer centricity, and like back when I was consulting in 2002 for Microsoft, I'm like, the developers need to be doing what we're doing, and if we build a tool, the developers need to run it. But it's hard, right? Because you're changing the development process, right? They don't want to change, right? They don't understand AppSec. They don't want to change. They want to do the very least amount of AppSec as possible. So one of the good things that Snyk has done is really raised awareness within the development community that this is something developers should be doing, and so it's allowed the market to grow. The market to grow for sure. You know, if the AppSec market is growing at like 15% a year, like new stuff has to constantly keep happening for that to happen. If there's no innovation from a competitor or internally from you or from startups that then you're acquiring, it doesn't keep growing, right? Because there's not more stuff to buy. So that's one of the things that the competitive dynamic I think is good, and that's one of the things that Snyk's done. And you know, we've done most of those things. Like now that's accepted. Like developers see it and they say, "Hey, I want this stuff in my repo. I want this stuff in the IDE," and then we build it, right? And I think it was always the right thing to do. But how the market gets there, a lot of times takes that competitive pressure and tension.
It's a nice segue because I wanted to hear a little bit more about your perspective on the DevSecOps movement and how that maybe influenced some of Veracode's strategy and overall product. And I think you just alluded to it a little bit there, where Snyk had this more kind of developer-centric focus, and then Veracode had to go ahead and adopt some of those capabilities as well to be able to cater to that market need. I mean, how do you think the DevSecOps kind of zeitgeist influenced Veracode for better or for worse in terms of overall kind of market positioning and product capabilities?
Yeah, so the biggest thing for DevSecOps is the development team owns everything, right? There's no separate team that they hand things off to, does something and gets handed back to them. The development team owns everything from design to coding to testing to running it in production. And of course, DevSecOps is they own security too. So you know that it makes total sense. The idea of a separate team, you know, assessing the developer's work and then telling them what's wrong with it. I mean, I started off in my career as a developer building QA tools at a company that you're probably too young to remember, Lotus, which made the first spreadsheet. Lotus 123. And so at Lotus, I built QA tools that the QA team would run, and then we'd find bugs and we'd hand them over to the development team, and then they would fight over whether it's really a bug and they should really fix it or not, which is not a great dynamic. It's this us and them kind of thing. And that was replicated in the first years of AppSec before DevSecOps came around. You had you had a separate team that was running the assessments. And it was just always a very painful interaction. So DevSecOps, once it's adopted, the development team owns the security assessments. They have to assess themselves, just like they have to test their own code. They have to write their own unit tests, their own feature tests, and it's the same thing. And so the people that are writing the code are responsible for assessing it and responsible for fixing it. Now, that's a great idea, but of course, it's getting the tools to work well within the developer workflows, and that's constantly changing, right? Developers are constantly using new there's like, the IDEs keep evolving. Now we have, Copilot in the IDEs. The environment, keeps changing, and we're using different tools to build and deploy. And it doesn't change like yearly, but it changes over, every few years. It's new. So DevSecOps means that the application security companies have to fit into whatever people are using, the IDEs, the repo tools and things like that. And it is a challenge. It's another matrix of things to support. But whenever you say these things, it's a challenge. It's also a competitive moat, right? Because like startups, it's really hard for them to support like 35 different languages, right? They end up supporting the 3 most popular ones, and that doesn't work for enterprises, right? So you don't get customers that are over $1 billion in revenue. It just doesn't happen. So the tooling is the same thing. Like we have to support all the IDEs. We have to support, Azure and GitLab and GitHub and Bitbucket and all these things equally well. So those are the challenges, but it's also a benefit, right? Because you get that competitive moat because you've built it and you have the team to maintain it.
Right. And part of the reason I asked this is I was at KPMG and we were working with Veracode back in 2019 or so, working pretty closely with the team, trying to develop that partnership. And this was around when the pipeline scan tool had come out. And we remember kind of comparing some of the results from like the full SaaS scan to the pipeline scan and what was coming out there. And obviously there was a lot of work that was going into that tool in terms of better integrating these scanning capabilities into the CI/CD pipelines that these different developers and development teams were running. And it was interesting to kind of compare the differences between the feature set of the full scan and then clearly see that prioritization and some of the gaps that were there at the time in terms of language support and different capabilities in terms of what was being looked for. And then obviously bridging that gap over time as we now think back on the progress over the last 5 years or so.
There's not really a free lunch, right? If you want something you want your analysis to run really fast, I'm sorry, but it is going to be more shallow, right?
For sure.
And for really large programs, you end up with the exponential number of variables and data flows and things like that, and it blows up really, really, really quickly. So you have to manage all of that if you have a time constraint. If you don't have a time constraint, if you're like, hey, I don't care if it comes back in a day or two, whatever, then you can always get a good analysis. But if you have big programs and you want a fast analysis, now you need a shallower scan. And one of our big lessons was that's what the developers want, right? They're happy with the shallower scan because their biggest need is speed. They don't want to wait for something. They have a deadline to get a feature into production, to start their A/B testing, or maybe there is a commitment with some customer or something. They just need to get it done. And that becomes more important than security. Now, the security team doesn't want to hear this, right? The security is like, give me the deep analysis. I want to know all the risk that's going into production. And the development team says, all right, let's compromise and we'll run it on every push to production, but it's got to be fast. And so those are some of the trade-offs you do. And then over time, you figure out how to make that fast scan better and better and better. But it doesn't happen overnight. You can't go from deep and slow to deep and fast right away.
Right.
Something has to give.
So tell me a little bit more about what's next for Veracode looking ahead today. You mentioned the Longbow acquisition, the transition into the kind of broader ASPM platform. I mean, what is it that the team is focusing on, maybe from a technical lens, given your position, and thinking about how to kind of continue that differentiation, continue building that moat, as you put it previously?
Yeah. So again, this is another thing that's been a long time coming, is not just ASPM, but really, because you could have ASPM that is just connecting pre-production tools. ASPM is really about managing a lot of different analysis and making sense of it, and building it into a developer's workflow and prioritizing it. So ASPM gives you that. But now with things like Longbow, it's okay, well, let's actually bring in runtime risk. Let's bring in infrastructure risk. Let's bring in that CSPM risk into ASPM. So I like to think of it as both its ASPM and its infrastructure / CSPM risk. And that and I mentioned before, we always had this thinking of you join multiple analysis, techniques together, simplified policies, simplified reporting. Well, now Longbow gives us that for analysis that we don't do natively at Veracode, with the connecting to the output of that. But the other great thing it does is something that I've always really wanted to do, which is combine application security and infrastructure security, and not have these be completely separate silos, right? Silos are bad in security because attackers don't operate in silos, right? Attackers go where they can go. They look for the weak link. It doesn't matter if it's a cross-site scripting or a default password or a session key they found hanging around. They don't care. And so this crosses all these different domains, and AppSec and infrastructure security really need to be combined. Back in 2013, I gave a RSA presentation with this. It was actually a small infrastructure vulnerability management company called Digital Defense, and I knew the CTO there, and I said, "Why don't we talk about the future being combining these two things together?" And like a lot of things in security, people just aren't ready yet. Like AppSec wasn't mature enough to then let's add this whole nother thing onto it back in 2013. It just people, this is even the DevSecOps was just getting started back then. So people weren't ready for it. But here in 2024, they're completely ready for it because they've already baked in AppSec into their automated pipelines and their automated processes running in the it's running in the pipeline, or it's running in the repo. And people clearly have automated infrastructure security that's going on. So we're ready to combine these two things together and connect to get the true risk of the combined code and the environment the code is running in. And in the past, we've always sort of had to kind of estimate it. It's like, oh, well, this app is internet facing, so let's mark this one high risk and put a high risk policy on it. Now we know it's internet facing because we're scanning the runtime environment. We're like, this one's internet facing, so do these things. So there's no more. I guess we're getting rid of people. We're getting rid of consultants. But that's the only way that this stuff scales, and that has been the whole journey of Veracode. Is let's automate as much as possible so it can scale as much as possible.
And like we talked about as well, right? With developers being responsible for more of these different activities through the whole DevSecOps transition, makes more sense for kind of combining some of the infrastructure information with the application information, because developers are oftentimes the ones spinning up the different cloud resources that might have some of these flaws. And if they're responsible for fixing these issues on both sides, and they should be made aware of them as well under kind of a unified platform.
Absolutely. So if we find something in production that can be fixed by changing some infrastructure as code, something like that, then we connect it to that infrastructure as code in a particular repo and open up a bug and assign it to a developer on that project. So the work actually gets done. Like when you have silos, you need a team of people to be like, well, who's going to fix this?
Right.
Like, let me take these two silos together and generate, understand risk. And there's all this manual effort. And it's always done poorly. And nothing gets done until there's a ticket generated, right?
Yep.
That's we obviously have product security here at Veracode. And that's our mantra. If there's no ticket saying this work needs to be done, the work will not be done.
Yeah.
So if you can automatically open that ticket, and then the work will be done. But the next best thing than opening the ticket is auto remediation, right? Don't assign it to a developer, fix it, and then have them just approve the fix. So that's the other exciting thing happening at Veracode. We launched Veracode Fix last year at RSA. Which fixes, remediates code using a GPT AI, and that's really the other piece of the future. And we want to do that to more than code. We want to do that to infrastructure as code. We want to do that to other cloud configuration issues. So now that we have Longbow and auto remediation, we just think that these two things can be combined to fix more than a cross-site scripting or a SQL injection, which is what we started with.
Perfect. Well, Chris, thank you so much. Really appreciate hearing your story. Such a fascinating journey in terms of 17, 18 years at this point, and seeing the company go through so many different stages and being such an important member of the team throughout that entire journey. So again, really appreciate you sharing some wisdom here.
Great to talk with you, Kyle. I enjoyed talking about the story.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can write to me at kyle@secureventures.io. I'm Kyle McNulty, and you've been listening to Secure Ventures.